July 8, 1944. 15:20 hours. Field Hospital, Saipan. Private Takeshi Yamamoto lay on the stretcher waiting to die. The bullet had torn through his abdomen 3 hours earlier during the final Japanese counterattack. He'd crawled into a shell crater as American forces swept past, expecting to bleed out quietly. Instead, Marine Corpsmen had found him, lifted him onto a stretcher despite his weak protests, and carried him here. Now he waited for the execution he'd been promised since basic training. Every Japanese soldier knew what happened to prisoners: torture, mutilation, death. The training films had shown it. Officers had described it in graphic detail. Better to die fighting or by your own hand than face what the Americans would do to you. Through pain-fogged vision, Yamamoto watched an American medic approach. This was it. The blade or bullet that would end his dishonor. He closed his eyes, whispered a prayer to the Emperor, waited for death. Something cold pressed against his arm. He flinched, expecting pain. Instead, numbness spreading from the injection site. The agony in his gut began fading. His muscles relaxed despite his will to remain tense. Morphine, though he didn't know the English word for it. The medic's hands were gentle, checking his wounds, calling out something in English. Other voices responded. Someone cut away his blood-soaked uniform. Yamamoto tried to speak, to demand they just kill him quickly, but the morphine had stolen his words. He felt himself being lifted, carried into a tent where bright lights burned despite the afternoon sun. Faces in surgical masks looked down at him. American faces. Enemy faces. He'd killed Americans, shot at them during the Banzai charge, maybe hit some. Now they stood over him with scalpels and needles, and he understood this was the torture, the experimentation on living prisoners the officers had warned about. One of the masked faces said something soft. A woman's voice. A nurse. Her hand touched his forehead, cool and steady. Not cruel. Not angry. Just professional. Checking his temperature like his own mother had done when he was sick as a child. The last thing Yamamoto saw before the anesthesia took him was an American doctor leaning over with instruments, preparing to cut into him. Not to torture, not to kill, to operate, to save him. He woke 12 hours later, alive, clean bandages wrapped around his abdomen, lying in a cot beside wounded American soldiers who ignored him completely. The shock of survival, of mercy from enemies he'd been taught, were demons, shattered every certainty his military training had built. The Americans, supposedly monsters, had given him blood, morphine, surgery, and life when his own commanders would have ordered him to die rather than surrender. The doctrine of death. Japanese military indoctrination spent years conditioning soldiers to fear capture more than death itself. From the moment conscripts entered training, they learned surrender was the ultimate dishonor. The Senjin-kun military code, distributed to every soldier in 1941, stated explicitly, "Do not live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor." Officers reinforced this daily. Capture meant eternal disgrace for you and your family. Better to die fighting. Better to commit suicide. Better to throw yourself on grenades than face the shame of enemy hands. The indoctrination went beyond shame to fear. Training films and lectures described American treatment of prisoners in horrific detail. Torture, experimentation, mutilation, execution. Soldiers were shown fabricated photographs of supposed atrocities. Officers described how Americans would cut off prisoners' ears, gouge out eyes, dismember captured soldiers alive for entertainment. "We were told Americans were animals disguised as humans," recalled Sergeant Masao Tanaka, captured on Okinawa in 1945. "That they would dissect us while we were still conscious, experiment on us with diseases, torture us for information, then kill us slowly." Every soldier believed this absolutely. It wasn't questioned. It was fact. This conditioning created genuine terror of capture. Wounded soldiers who could no longer fight would commit suicide rather than be taken prisoner. Officers who faced certain defeat would order their men to conduct suicidal banzai charges rather than surrender. Commanders caught in hopeless situations would execute wounded soldiers who couldn't evacuate, then kill themselves. On Saipan and Okinawa, thousands of civilians jumped from cliffs rather than face American capture, believing the propaganda about American atrocities. The few Japanese soldiers who were captured early in the war, unconscious from wounds, too injured to resist, separated and surrounded, would wake in captivity, expecting immediate execution or torture. Instead, they found something their training had never prepared them for: professional medical care that made no distinction between friend and enemy wounded. The numbers of mercy. American military doctrine treated all wounded as patients requiring care, regardless of nationality. The Geneva Conventions, which the United States followed even though Japan had not ratified them, required medical treatment for wounded prisoners. But American practice went beyond legal requirements. Field hospitals, aid stations, and hospital ships treated enemy wounded with the same professional standards as American casualties. The statistics revealed systematic mercy. Saipan, June to July 1944. Japanese prisoners taken, approximately 1,800, most captured wounded, unconscious, or too injured to resist. Received medical treatment, 100%. Surgical operations performed on prisoners, 483. Mortality rate among wounded POWs, 12% compared to 40% plus expected without treatment. Philippines Campaign, 1944-1945. Japanese prisoners taken, approximately $10,500, treated for wounds or disease, roughly $4,200. Blood transfusions given to enemy wounded, 731 units. Prisoners receiving medication, antibiotics, morphine, antimalarials, approximately $3,800. Okinawa, April-June 1945. Japanese prisoners taken, approximately $7,400, received medical care, 100%, major surgical procedures on prisoners, 1,847, amputation operations that saved prisoners' lives. 234. The numbers told a story. American forces systematically saved enemy lives. Soldiers who expected execution found themselves receiving surgery, blood transfusions, medications, and post-operative care identical to what American wounded received. Prisoners who believed they'd be tortured instead found themselves lying in hospital tents beside American soldiers, all receiving the same professional medical attention. Saipan, the first mass shock. The battle for Saipan in June-July 1944 created the first large-scale encounter between Japanese expectations of captivity and American medical reality. As Japanese defenses collapsed, thousands of soldiers and civilians chose suicide over capture. The cliffs at Marpi Point became infamous. Families jumping to their deaths, rather than face Americans they'd been taught were demons. Yet several hundred Japanese soldiers, wounded too severely to kill themselves or unconscious from blood loss, were captured by Marine and Army forces who immediately brought them to field hospitals. These wounded prisoners arrived expecting execution. Instead, they found organized medical facilities where American doctors, nurses, and corpsmen worked methodically to save their lives. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Yancey, chief surgeon at the 2nd Marine Division Field Hospital, described the typical prisoner arrival. They'd come in on stretchers, conscious prisoners crying or praying, expecting us to kill them. Some would try to refuse treatment, believing we were going to torture them. We'd give them morphine first, get the pain under control, then explain through interpreters that we were going to operate to save their lives. The disbelief on their faces was universal. They literally couldn't process what we were telling them. The field hospital on Saipan treated 326 wounded Japanese prisoners during July 1944. Operations included 89 abdominal surgeries for gunshot and shrapnel wounds, 47 amputations necessitated by severe limb trauma, 73 head wound treatments, 52 chest surgeries, 65 complex orthopedic procedures. Each operation used the same standards, equipment, and techniques applied to American casualties. Japanese prisoners received morphine for pain, ether or sodium pentothal for anesthesia, sulfa drugs, and later penicillin to prevent infection, blood transfusions when needed, post-operative monitoring, and follow-up care during recovery. "We didn't ask what side they fought for," said Corporal James Mitchell, surgical assistant. "A gut wound is a gut wound. Bleeding is bleeding. You stop it, clean it, close it, and try to keep the patient alive. That's the job." For Japanese prisoners, the experience was psychologically devastating, not because of cruelty, but because of unexpected mercy that contradicted years of indoctrination. The blood transfusion. Private Hiroshi Yamamoto woke from surgery in the Saipan Field Hospital on July 15, 1944. He'd been shot through the shoulder and chest during the final Japanese counterattack, left for dead by retreating forces, found by Marines who'd brought him to the hospital despite his attempts to refuse treatment. As consciousness returned, Yamamoto felt the IV needle in his arm, followed the tube with his eyes to the bag hanging above him. Blood. He was receiving a transfusion. American blood. A Nisei interpreter, Sergeant Daniel Inouye, noticed Yamamoto's awareness. "You lost a lot of blood," Inouye explained in Japanese. "The doctors gave you a transfusion. You're going to survive." Yamamoto stared at the blood bag. "American blood?" he whispered. "Yes. Type O negative. Universal donor. Could have come from any soldier in the division." The implications hit Yamamoto like a physical blow. An American soldier, possibly someone Yamamoto had shot at, whose friends Yamamoto had killed, had donated blood that now flowed in his veins, keeping him alive. The enemy he'd been taught to see as subhuman demons was literally sustaining his life with their own blood. "Why?" Yamamoto managed. Inouye shrugged. "Because you needed it. Because you were bleeding to death, and we could save you. Why wouldn't we?" This simple pragmatism was incomprehensible to a soldier who'd been conditioned to believe enemies would torture him. The blood transfusion became a recurring symbol in POW testimonies, the most visceral evidence of American humanity. Japanese prisoners, realizing they survived because Americans had given them their own blood, experienced cognitive dissonance that shattered indoctrination. "I tried to kill Americans," Yamamoto said during his first full interrogation. "Now, American blood keeps me alive. I cannot understand this. My officers said you were demons, but demons do not save their enemies' lives." The nurses' care. The presence of women providing care to wounded prisoners created additional psychological impact. American military nurses, professional, competent, treating enemy wounded with the same attentiveness they gave American soldiers, contradicted Japanese expectations about female roles and American brutality. Japanese propaganda had portrayed American women as degraded and immoral. Instead, prisoners encountered educated professionals who demonstrated clinical skill and human compassion. Lieutenant Helen Chang, Army nurse with the 27th Infantry Division on Saipan, treated dozens of wounded Japanese prisoners. "They were terrified of me at first. Some would turn their faces away, refusing to look at a woman. Others seemed shocked that a woman was treating them. But after a few days, they'd relax. They'd accept water from me, let me change bandages without resistance. Some would bow their heads in thanks when I'd help them. The barriers would break down. The care was meticulous. Nurses monitored vital signs, administered medications, changed dressings, bathed patients too weak to wash themselves, assisted with feeding, and provided emotional support during recovery. For Japanese prisoners accustomed to military hierarchy, where officers lorded over subordinates and weakness was despised, this gentle professionalism from women was bewildering. Private Kenji Sato, wounded on Saipan, later testified, "The American nurse, I never learned her name, would check my wounds twice daily. She was gentle, careful not to cause unnecessary pain. She would smile and speak in English I couldn't understand, but her tone was kind. I had been taught American women were corrupt. This woman was more professional and caring than any medical personnel I'd encountered in the Japanese army." The interrogation connection. Medical care created unexpected opportunities for intelligence gathering as prisoners' psychological defenses collapsed. The shock of receiving life-saving treatment from expected executioners made many prisoners emotionally vulnerable and willing to provide information. This wasn't torture or coercion, it was the opposite. Prisoners who'd been saved by American doctors and nurses felt gratitude that overcame military loyalty. Captain Richard Owens, intelligence officer with the 96th Infantry Division, described the pattern. A wounded prisoner would come in expecting death. We'd save his life, treat him with respect, feed him, give him clean clothes. A few days later, when we'd bring him in for interrogation, he'd be cooperative, sometimes eager to answer questions. They'd say things like, "You saved me when my own officers would have ordered me to die. I will tell you what I know." This intelligence proved valuable. Prisoners provided information about Japanese defensive positions, unit strengths, command structures, and strategic plans. Not through torture or threats, but through the psychological impact of mercy from enemies they'd been taught were inhuman. The interrogation transcripts reveal the cognitive dissonance. Prisoners struggling to reconcile indoctrination with reality, propaganda with experience, abstract loyalty to the emperor with concrete gratitude to Americans who'd saved their lives. One prisoner, interrogated on Okinawa in May 1945, stated, "I was taught Americans were beasts. They gave me surgery and blood and food. I was taught capture meant torture. They gave me medicine and kindness. Everything I was told was lies. So I will tell you what you want to know, because you earned that by saving my life when you had every right to let me die." The psychological transformation. The medical care created fundamental shifts in prisoners' worldviews that persisted through and beyond the war. Prisoners who'd believed Americans were subhuman demons discovered they'd been systematically lied to. This revelation extended beyond immediate circumstances to question everything Japanese military and government had told them. If propaganda about American treatment of prisoners was false, what else was false? If Americans showed mercy while Japanese officers showed cruelty, who were the real demons? This psychological transformation happened gradually. First came shock, disbelief at receiving care rather than execution. Then came confusion, trying to reconcile propaganda with reality. Then came anger, recognizing they'd been deceived. Finally came reassessment, reevaluating loyalty, nationalism, and the war's purpose. Dr. Harold Jacobson, psychiatrist with the Army Medical Corps, interviewed dozens of Japanese prisoners recovering from wounds. They were experiencing cognitive dissonance so severe it was almost traumatic. Everything they'd based their identity on, loyalty to the emperor, Japanese superiority, American evil, was being contradicted by direct experience. Some had complete psychological breaks. Others slowly reconstructed their understanding of the world. All of them were changed by the medical care they received. One prisoner, recovering from surgery at the hospital on Guam, told Jacobson, "I believed I was a warrior serving the divine emperor against subhuman enemies. Now I am a patient being treated by doctors I tried to kill. They save my life with the same care they give their own soldiers. I must rethink everything I believed." The amputations. The most dramatic medical interventions, amputations that saved prisoners' lives, created lasting physical evidence of American care. Hundreds of Japanese prisoners received amputations necessitated by severe limb trauma, gangrene, or crushing injuries. These operations saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to sepsis or blood loss. For prisoners who woke to discover missing limbs, the physical reality reinforced psychological transformation. Private Yoshio Yamamoto lost his left leg below the knee following a shrapnel wound on Okinawa. The amputation, performed by American surgeons in June 1945, prevented infection from spreading. Yamamoto woke to find himself one-legged but alive, fitted with temporary bandaging that would later be replaced with a prosthetic. "I was angry at first," Yamamoto recalled. "My leg was gone. But the American doctor explained that without amputation, infection would have killed me. The surgery was clean, professional. The recovery care was excellent. Eventually I understood. They saved my life at the cost of my leg. I could live, work, have a family. Without their care, I would have died on Okinawa." The prosthetics program created additional impact. American medical facilities fitted prisoners with artificial limbs, teaching them to walk again, providing rehabilitation that enabled functionality despite their injuries. Prisoners who expected to be crippled, disabled veterans instead found themselves receiving advanced medical technology and professional therapy. The prosthetic leg came from American resources, Yamamoto continued. Made by American specialists, fitted by American doctors, taught to use by American physical therapists. I would spend the rest of my life walking on American generosity. How could I continue to believe Americans were evil? The medications. Access to advanced medications, sulfa drugs, penicillin, morphine, quinine, demonstrated American medical sophistication and willingness to use precious resources on prisoners. By 1944, American forces had access to antibiotics that Japan lacked in sufficient quantities. Penicillin, discovered in 1928 but not mass-produced until the 1940s, was available to American medical units and used freely on both American soldiers and enemy prisoners. Sulfa drugs treated bacterial infections. Morphine controlled pain. Quinine and later synthetic antimalarials treated tropical diseases. Japanese prisoners receiving these medications experienced faster recoveries, fewer complications, and higher survival rates than they would have received in Japanese military hospitals, if they'd received treatment at all. Many prisoners recognized the medications as advanced, understanding implicitly they were receiving better care as prisoners than they'd received as Japanese soldiers. Corporal Masao Ito, captured wounded on Leyte in December 1944, developed severe infection following a gunshot wound. American doctors treated him with penicillin, still relatively new and valuable. The infection that would have killed me was cured in days, Ito testified. The American medicine was like magic. Japanese military hospitals had nothing comparable. I was receiving better medical care as an American prisoner than I ever received serving the emperor. The medication's value was obvious even to prisoners without medical training. The speed of healing, the reduction of pain, the prevention of complications, all demonstrated that Americans possessed both advanced medical technology and willingness to expend it on enemy wounded. The field hospital reality. Life in American field hospitals exposed prisoners to operational realities that further contradicted propaganda. Wounded prisoners lay in tents beside wounded Americans, separated only by organizational convenience rather than antagonism. They witnessed American medical personnel working exhausting hours treating casualties from both sides. They saw American soldiers being given the same medications, undergoing similar surgeries, receiving identical post-operative care. The equality of treatment was obvious and jarring. Japanese military medicine had strict hierarchies. Officers received better care than enlisted men. Critical personnel received priority over ordinary soldiers. American medical practice treated all patients according to medical need, rather than rank or nationality. Private Takeshi Yamada, recovering from abdominal surgery on Guam, described the hospital environment. I was in a tent with 12 beds. 6 held American soldiers, 6 held Japanese prisoners. The nurses and doctors moved between us without distinction. We all received medication at the same times, had wounds checked on the same schedule, were fed the same food. The Americans did not receive better treatment because they were Americans. We were all just patients. This observation recurred in prisoner testimonies. The discovery that American medical personnel treated enemy wounded as patients requiring care rather than enemies deserving punishment. The professionalism that made no distinction based on nationality created powerful evidence of American humanity. The interrogator's dilemma. American intelligence officers discovered that medical care created ethical complications around prisoner interrogation. The psychological vulnerability created by life-saving treatment raised questions about exploitation. Were prisoners cooperating freely or feeling obligated by gratitude? Was using medical care to soften prisoners for interrogation ethical, even if no explicit coercion occurred? Major Robert Hansen, interrogation specialist with the Marine Corps, wrestled with this tension. We'd save a prisoner's life, treat him well, then bring him in for questioning when he was grateful and cooperative. It felt like exploitation, even though we'd have saved his life regardless of intelligence value. The medical care wasn't conditional. We treated prisoners because Geneva Conventions and military doctrine required it. But it created situations where prisoners felt indebted and would provide information they might otherwise have withheld. Some intelligence officers argued this was acceptable psychological operations. Using murder was too dry. The nurse brought water, helped him sip. The act of kindness, helping an enemy drink, broke something inside him. He began crying silently. The nurse misinterpreted his tears as pain, checking his morphine levels. But Watanabe wasn't crying from physical pain. He was crying because he'd spent 3 years believing Americans were demons, had tried to kill them in battle, and now discovered they'd saved his life with professional medical care that exceeded anything Japanese military medicine had provided. His entire worldview was collapsing. The emperor, the war, the propaganda, his military service, all of it suddenly seemed hollow compared to the simple human mercy of enemies treating his wounds. The final recognition. By war's end, thousands of Japanese prisoners had experienced this transformation. Men who'd expected torture and death instead received surgery, medication, care, and survival. The statistics were undeniable. Tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners treated by American medical personnel. Thousands of surgical procedures performed on enemy wounded. Survival rates approaching 90% for prisoners who reached medical facilities alive. 0 documented cases of deliberate medical abuse or experimentation. The contrast with Japanese propaganda could not have been more complete. Every prisoner who survived because of American medical care became living evidence that the propaganda had been systematically false. For American medical personnel, treating enemy wounded was simply following doctrine and professional ethics. For Japanese prisoners, it was revelation that redefined their understanding of both enemies and themselves. The medical tents where Americans saved Japanese lives became sites of transformation, where ideology met reality, where propaganda collapsed under evidence, where enemies discovered shared humanity that transcended nationalism and war. Private Takeshi Yamamoto, the soldier whose story opened this narrative, survived his abdominal wounds thanks to American surgery. He spent the rest of the war in POW camps, then returned to Japan in 1946. He lived until 1998, carrying for 53 years the memory of waking from anesthesia to discover enemies had saved his life. In a 1987 interview, he was asked what moment during the war had greatest impact on him. He didn't mention battles or defeats, or even Japan's surrender. He described waking in the field hospital on mercy to achieve military objectives without violence or coercion. Others felt uncomfortable with what seemed like manipulating prisoners' gratitude for intelligence purposes. The debate continued through the war without resolution, though practice remained consistent. Wounded prisoners received full medical care, then were interrogated after recovery. The intelligence gathered proved valuable, but the ethical questions persisted. The long-term impact. Japanese prisoners' experiences with American medical care influenced their post-war lives and attitudes toward the United States. Many former prisoners became advocates for Japanese-American reconciliation, using their experiences as evidence that Americans were not the monsters propaganda had portrayed. Some emigrated to the United States. Others worked in post-war reconstruction, helping rebuild Japanese-American relations. Sergeant Masao Tanaka, who received life-saving surgery on Okinawa, later worked as a translator for American occupation forces. I survived because Americans saved my life when they could have let me die. This changed me completely. After the war, I wanted to help build friendship between our countries because I knew from direct experience that Americans could show mercy to their enemies. The medical care's impact extended to former prisoners' families. Children and grandchildren heard stories about American doctors and nurses who saved their fathers' and grandfathers' lives. These family narratives created generational attitudes toward the United States shaped by wartime mercy rather than wartime violence. The surgical tent, September 3, 1944. Field Hospital, Paliliu. Private First Class Kenji Watanabe lay on the operating table, semi-conscious from morphine, as American Surgeon Commander Richard Brody worked to remove shrapnel from his chest cavity. The metal fragments had punctured Watanabe's lung, causing internal bleeding that would have killed him within hours without intervention. Brody operated with the same focused precision he'd applied to a dozen American casualties earlier that day. The nationality of the patient was irrelevant. The medical problem was what mattered. Punctured lung requiring repair. Internal bleeding requiring cauterization. Shrapnel requiring extraction. Infection risk requiring antibiotics. 2 hours later, Watanabe woke in recovery. Clean bandages covered his chest. An IV dripped medication into his arm. His breathing, though painful, was regular. He was alive. An American nurse noticed his consciousness. She smiled, checked his vital signs, adjusted his IV, and said something in English he couldn't understand. Her tone was reassuring, professional, kind. Watanabe tried to speak, to ask why they'd saved him, but his throat pan, realizing Americans had operated on him instead of executing him, understanding that everything he'd been taught about the enemy was lies. "I was supposed to die for the Emperor," Yamamoto said. "American doctors saved me instead." In that moment, I stopped believing in propaganda and started believing in evidence. The evidence was clear. I was alive because of mercy from people I'd been taught were incapable of mercy. That changed everything. The medical care American forces provided to Japanese prisoners, professional, comprehensive, life-saving, accomplished something military victory alone could not. It proved through direct experience that humanity could survive hatred, that mercy could follow violence, and that even enemies could recognize each other's humanity when given the opportunity. In saving even their enemies' lives, American medical personnel demonstrated values that outlived the war itself. Evidence that even in warfare's brutality, some people would choose to heal rather than harm, to save rather than kill, to show mercy when vengeance would have been easier and expected.